You ever have one of those days where you just want a quiet drink? A moment to wash the dust out of your throat and forget the world exists? That's all Thaddeus Royce wanted. 3 long days mending fences under the brutal Arizona sun, his skin baked to leather, his hands cracked and calloused. All he wanted was the familiar burn of cheap whiskey at McCain's Saloon. Just one drink, and then back to the 40 miles of blessed solitude that separated his ranch from the cesspool they called civilization. But the moment he pushed through those batwing doors, he knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the smell, a foul mix of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco. It was the silence. Saloons are never silent. They're a symphony of clinking glasses, bad piano music, and loud lies. But tonight, McCain's was as quiet as a graveyard. Every drunk, every gambler, every lost soul in that room was staring at the center of the floor. And what they were staring at made Thaddeus Royce's blood run cold. There on a makeshift platform of stacked whiskey crates stood a woman. She couldn't have been more than 28, her dark skin glowing under the greasy light of the oil lamps. She wore a simple blue dress, faded and worn, but she stood there with her chin held high, like a queen surveying a kingdom of swine. And then the auctioneer's voice cut through the smoke, a sound like a rusted blade. "Lot 17, Vernon McCain slurred, his snake-like smile revealing a gold tooth. "Young, strong, good teeth. And this one can read and write, gentlemen. A real prize." Thaddeus felt the floor drop out from under him. An auction, not for cattle, not for land, for a human being. Here, 1885. 20 years after the war that had supposedly settled this whole damn thing. The war that had ripped his own soul to pieces and sent him running to the edge of the world. He gripped the edge of the bar, his knuckles white. The woman on the block, her name was Celeste Washington, he heard McCain say. And her eyes. That's what hit him like a physical blow. They weren't filled with fear or submission. They were blazing with a cold, quiet rage. A fire that promised to burn down everything in its path. A fire that promised consequences. "Bidding starts at $50, McCain shouted, his greedy eyes scanning the crowd. A fat man in a bowler hat, sweating profusely despite the evening chill, raised a sausage-like finger. "60 for the kitchen work." Another voice from the back, thin and reedy. "70. She can teach my boys their letters." Thaddeus's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. This was why he'd left. This was the disease he'd tried to escape. He'd built his ranch, the Circle R, 40 miles out, a fortress of solitude where he could pretend the world had learned something from all the blood and the dying. He preferred the company of cattle and the lonely whisper of the desert wind. They were honest, at least. But as he watched Celeste, he saw her hands tremble. Just for a second. It was the only crack in her armor of defiance. A tiny sign that the woman with fire in her eyes was just as terrified as anyone would be. And in that tremor, Thaddeus saw the ghosts of Antietam. He saw the faces of good men, boys really, staring up at a sky they'd never see again. He remembered the smell of cannon smoke and the promises he'd made to the dying. Promises he'd failed to keep. $80, the bowler hat man bellowed, his face flushed with excitement. 80, going once. McCain's voice was slick with greed. A fine specimen, gentlemen. Educated, healthy, prime working years ahead. Thaddeus's hand instinctively went to the leather pouch on his belt. Inside was the weight of months of backbreaking work. Silver dollars he'd been saving for new breeding stock. Money that was supposed to secure his future, his isolation. His entire life was in that pouch. But then, Celeste's gaze swept across the room. It passed over the leering faces, the drunken smiles, the empty eyes. And for a fraction of a second, her eyes locked with his. And what he saw in them changed everything. It wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't a cry for a savior. It was a challenge. A silent, desperate question. Are you just like all the rest? 80, going twice. And in that moment, Thaddeus Royce knew he couldn't be. He couldn't be the man who stood by and did nothing. Not again. He'd spent 15 years running from the man he used to be. The man who made promises. The man who fought for something. That man died on a battlefield in Maryland. or so he thought. That's when Thaddeus Royce stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the dusty floorboards was like a gunshot in the dead silent room. Every single head in McCain's saloon swiveled towards him, towards the ghost. The tall, weather-beaten rancher who hadn't been seen in town for 6 months. The man who avoided people like they were the plague itself. And his voice, when it came, was as cold and steady as winter steel. $100. The words sliced through the thick, smoky air. The piano player, who had started to idly tinkle the keys again, froze mid-note. The fat man in the bowler hat stared, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. The entire saloon went completely, utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the filthy floor. Vernon McCain's gold-toothed grin, which had been stretched ear to ear, faltered. Just for a second. Then it spread even wider, like a rattlesnake that had just spotted a particularly juicy mouse. Well, well, McCain drawled, his beady eyes locking onto Thaddeus. Thaddeus Royce himself. Haven't seen you in town for, 6 months? Thought you'd sworn off civilization entirely. Thaddeus didn't answer. He stepped forward, his spurs clicking a grim rhythm on the wooden planks. He could feel the weight of every man's gaze on him, a heavy, suffocating blanket of confusion. Why? They were all thinking. Why would the hermit rancher, the man who lived 40 miles out in the dust and the heat, suddenly throw down a fortune for her? But Thaddeus wasn't looking at them. He wasn't looking at McCain. His eyes were locked on Celeste. She was watching him, her expression an unreadable mix of shock, suspicion, and something else. Something that might have been a flicker of hope. She was smart. In her position, trust was a poison you couldn't afford to drink. $100, Thaddeus repeated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He reached into his leather pouch, his calloused fingers finding 5 heavy $20 gold pieces. He walked to the nearest poker table and set them down one by one. The clink of each coin hitting the wood was an exclamation point. Deliberate, precise, final. The man in the bowler hat sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. Now hold on there, McCain. I was bidding fair and square. Business is business, McCain snapped, but his eyes never left Thaddeus. There was something new in his expression now, something calculating. He was working a puzzle, and he didn't like the shape of the pieces. Though I have to say, Royce, he continued, his voice dripping with false curiosity, this seems out of character. What exactly does a man like you plan to do with educated help, all the way out on that godforsaken ranch of yours? The question hung in the air like a noose. The implications were ugly, and they made Thaddeus's stomach turn. He knew what they were all thinking. But he'd learned long ago that you don't wrestle with pigs in the mud. You just stare them down until they blink. That's my business, Thaddeus said simply. And then something strange happened. Celeste's eyes narrowed, just slightly, and he saw her give an almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was so small, so fast, anyone else would have missed it, but he didn't. She was warning him. This woman, standing on a whiskey crate being sold like a sack of flour, was trying to protect him. From what? From a trap he couldn't see? 110, the bowler hat man shouted, not willing to give up. But McCain raised a hand, silencing him, and a cold dread slithered down Thaddeus's spine. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place for McCain, and the picture they were forming was ugly. Actually, gentlemen, McCain announced, a triumphant gleam in his eyes, I'm withdrawing Lot 17 from tonight's auction. The room erupted in protests and confused murmurs, but McCain's voice cut through the noise like a whip crack. You see, I've just remembered. Miss Washington here has some outstanding debts, legal matters that need to be sorted before any transactions can take place. Thaddeus's hand moved, his fingers brushing the worn leather of his holster where his Colt .45 rested. He'd seen this game before. It was a classic grift, the shifting rules, the moving goalposts, the way corrupt men twisted law and custom to bleed every last dollar from a situation. He glanced at Celeste. Her composure, that iron wall of defiance, finally cracked. Just for a second, he saw a flash of pure, undiluted terror in her eyes before she slammed the gates shut again. Whatever McCain was planning, it was a hell of a lot worse than being sold to a sweaty man in a bowler hat. What kind of debts? Thaddeus asked, his voice deceptively calm, dangerously quiet. McCain's smile was all teeth and venom. The kind that require personal attention to resolve. He signaled to two of his hired goons, who had been leaning against the back wall. Thaddeus recognized them. They were the kind of men who solve problems with brass knuckles and shallow graves. Don't you worry about it, Royce. I'm sure a man of your solitary habits can find other ways to spend his money. This was never about the auction. The auction was just the stage. This was the real play. But it wasn't about money anymore, was it? Thaddeus could feel it in his bones. This was about power. And McCain had just made it terrifyingly clear that he wasn't just trying to sell Celeste Washington, he was trying to make her disappear. And the silence that followed was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of complicity, the silence of men who knew something evil was happening and were choosing to look away. But McCain wasn't done. Oh no, he was just getting started. He let the tension build, let the fear marinate in the smoky air. He was a showman, and this was his grand finale. The debt is simple, McCain continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the saloon. It was a stage whisper, meant for every ear. Miss Washington here. She killed a white man, 3 towns over. Sheriff in Tombstone's been looking for her for 2 weeks. The words hit the room like a stick of dynamite. Thaddeus felt every muscle in his body go rigid. A fugitive. A killer. If it was true, if any part of it was true, she wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was fighting for her life. A black woman accused of killing a white man in 1885 Arizona? There was no trial for that. There was only a rope. But something was wrong. The story didn't fit. The terror he'd seen in Celeste's eyes wasn't the fear of a killer about to be caught. It was something else. And the way McCain's eyes glittered with sadistic satisfaction, this was a lie. It had to be. A lie built on a foundation of truth, maybe, but a lie all the same. And then Celeste's voice, clear and strong, cut through the stunned silence. She didn't sound like a fugitive. She sounded like a judge delivering a verdict. That man, she said, her eyes fixed on McCain, tried to force himself on me in a hotel room. I defended myself, with a letter opener. Any decent court would call it justified. A decent court, McCain chuckled, a foul, wheezing sound. He shook his head with mock pity. Unfortunately for you, Miss Washington, decent courts don't exist for people like you. And the man you killed? The man you so bravely defended yourself against? He paused, letting the moment hang, savoring it. He was the mayor's son. Thaddeus's blood turned to ice water. There it was, the killing blow, the mayor's son. It didn't matter what he'd done. It didn't matter if he was the devil himself. In this part of the country, that was a death sentence, plain and simple. No jury would even pretend to listen. The story was perfect, airtight, a cage made of lies that was just as strong as iron bars. McCain's 2 hired guns, a mountain of a man with a scarred face named Knuckles, and a skinny weasel with dead eyes were moving closer. They moved with a slow, deliberate confidence. They knew what they were doing. They'd done it before. So here's what's going to happen, McCain said, addressing the room like a king addressing his court. Miss Washington is going to come with me to my office to discuss her situation privately. And anyone who interferes, he looked directly at Thaddeus, will be interfering with official law business, aiding and abetting a fugitive murderer. Thaddeus looked at Celeste, and this time he saw something that made his chest tighten into a painful knot. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, bleak resignation. She had fought, she had played her hand, and she had lost. The woman who had stood on that auction block with the posture of a queen was now preparing to die. But something still gnawed at Thaddeus. McCain could have just taken her. He could have claimed the bounty. Why the theater? Why the auction? Why the public spectacle? What's your real game here, McCain? Thaddeus asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. McCain's smile widened. It was the smile of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. No game, Royce. Just a civic-minded businessman helping the law do its job. He let out a theatrical sigh. Though, I suppose if someone were to compensate me for the considerable trouble and risk of harboring a known fugitive. He let the words hang in the air, and Thaddeus finally understood. The auction was just to gauge her value, to see who was interested. The murder charge was the leverage. It was never about the $50 or $100. It was a shakedown. A brutal, brilliant, evil shakedown. McCain wasn't going to turn her in. He was going to bleed someone dry, and then he was going to bury her in the desert anyway. You don't leave witnesses in a game like this. How much? Thaddeus asked, his voice a low growl. McCain's eyes lit up. The fish was on the hook. $500. Cash. The number was a physical blow. $500. It was more money than most men in that room would see in 2 years. It was enough to buy a small ranch, a herd of cattle, a new life. It was everything Thaddeus had, and more. He looked at Celeste, really looked at her, past the fear, past the resignation, and hidden deep in her eyes he saw a single tiny spark, a fragile ember of hope that he had accidentally fanned with his stupid, reckless bid. It was so small, so faint, he knew that if he walked away now, that spark would die, and so would she. And Thaddeus Royce, who had spent 15 long years running from the ghosts of his past, realized with a sickening certainty that he had just run right into the one moment, the one decision he could not escape. So what do you do? If you're Thaddeus Royce, what's your next move? Do you call his bluff? Do you walk away and let her die? Or do you find a way to pay an impossible price? Let me know in the comments what you would have done, because what Thaddeus did next, nobody saw coming. $500, Thaddeus repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. His weathered fingers drummed a slow, deliberate rhythm against his gun belt. It was a considerable sum for a civic-minded businessman. McCain's eyes narrowed. He was a snake, and snakes are patient. But Thaddeus's calm consideration was unnerving him. He had expected a flat-out refusal. He had expected an explosion of violence. He had not expected a quiet, thoughtful negotiation. In a room full of armed men, being unpredictable was a weapon in itself. Knuckles, the larger of McCain's two thugs, shifted his weight forward, his hand hovering over his gun. "Boss, maybe we should just—" "Shut up," McCain snapped, never taking his eyes off Thaddeus. "Mr. Royce is thinking. Aren't you, Royce?" Oh, Thaddeus was thinking. He was thinking about the 15 years he'd spent building his world, his sanctuary. Every fence post hammered into the hard ground, every calf pulled from its mother in the dead of winter. The ranch wasn't just land and wood, it was his penance. It was the one thing he had built that hadn't been destroyed by war. It was every dollar he'd ever earned, every drop of sweat he'd ever shed, his alone. But mostly he was thinking about Celeste Washington's hands, how they'd trembled just once when the bidding started, how they'd steadied into fists when she'd spoken about defending herself, how they were perfectly, unnaturally still now, because she absolutely knew, that she was probably going to die in the next 10 minutes. "I don't have $500, Thaddeus said finally. A triumphant grin spread across McCain's face, his gold tooth flashing in the lamplight. It was over. He'd won. "Well then," he purred, "I guess Miss Washington and I will be having that private conversation after all." He gestured for Knuckles and the other one to move in. "But," Thaddeus continued, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet that made every man in the saloon lean forward, straining to hear, "I've got something else, something you might find interesting." He reached slowly, deliberately into the inside pocket of his vest. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, soft as cloth at the creases from years of being carried close to his heart. McCain's eyes locked onto it like a hawk spotting a rabbit. "What's that supposed to be?" "Deed to the Circle R Ranch," Thaddeus said, his voice as steady as granite. 4,700 acres of prime grazing land, year-round water rights from the San Pedro River, and a cabin that's been improved every year for the past 15. He let the words sink in. Worth at least $2,000 to the right buyer. The saloon went so quiet you could hear the oil lamps sputter. Even McCain's hired muscle looked stunned. Everyone in 3 counties knew the story of Thaddeus Royce and his ranch. They knew he'd rather cut off his own arm than give up that land. It was the only thing he had ever cared about. The only thing that had kept him from completely disappearing into a bottle or putting a gun in his mouth after the war. It was his whole world on a single piece of paper. McCain's face was a battlefield of warring emotions. Greed, raw and powerful, fought against deep suspicion. It was too good to be true. There had to be a catch. You'd give up your ranch? For her? Thaddeus didn't look at McCain. He looked at Celeste. And for the first time since he'd walked into this nightmare, she looked genuinely, completely shocked. Her lips were parted slightly, her brow furrowed. He could see her mind racing, trying to solve the impossible equation of why. Why would a total stranger sacrifice everything he had in the world for someone he'd never even spoken to? I would, Thaddeus said simply, his eyes holding hers. And the question, when it came, wasn't from McCain. It was from Celeste herself. Her voice was barely a whisper, a fragile sound in the heavy silence. Why? Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. The saloon, the guns, the greed, it all faded away. And he was back in the mud and the blood, kneeling beside a boy from Georgia, a kid who'd fought on the other side, but in the end was just a boy, dying a long way from home. The kid's name was Isaac, and he'd made Thaddeus a promise to find his sister, a promise to tell her he was sorry, a promise Thaddeus had broken. He'd been too lost, too broken himself to ever even try. He'd run away instead. He looked at Celeste, at the impossible situation she was in, and saw a chance to finally keep a promise, a chance to be the man Isaac had thought he was. Because some things, he said, his voice thick with a history she couldn't possibly understand, are worth more than land. McCain was practically drooling. The ranch was a prize beyond his wildest dreams. But even in his greed, a cold calculation was forming in his eyes. Thaddeus saw it, the shift. The moment the predator decides to stop playing with its food. Interesting offer, Royce, McCain said slowly. A very generous offer. But here's the thing. His smile vanished. I don't think you're in a position to negotiate. And that's when Knuckles and his partner drew their guns. The slick, metallic whisper of steel-clearing leather was the deadliest sound Thaddeus had ever heard. And he realized with a chilling, crystal clarity that McCain had never intended to make a deal. Not for $500, not for the ranch. He was going to take the ranch, and he was going to eliminate the witness. He was going to have it all. But what McCain didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Thaddeus Royce hadn't survived Antietam, Gettysburg, and 15 years of fending for himself in the Arizona Territory by being slow. His Colt .45 was in his hand before McCain had even finished his sentence. It cleared the worn leather of his holster faster than a striking rattlesnake, the barrel swinging towards Knuckles before the hired gun could even thumb back the hammer on his own weapon. But just as his finger tightened on the trigger, just as he prepared to send Knuckles to hell, Thaddeus froze. Because Celeste Washington had moved. She had stepped directly off the whiskey crate platform and into his line of fire. She stood between him and Knuckles, her back to the gunman, her eyes locked on his. Don't, she said quietly, but her voice carried the force of a command. The moment you pull that trigger, you become the villain. Every lawman in Arizona will be hunting you down. The man who started a gunfight in a crowded saloon to help a known fugitive escape. You'll be running for the rest of your life. Knuckles let out a low, gravelly laugh, a sound like grinding glass. Smart girl. Drop the iron, cowboy, before someone gets hurt. Thaddeus's mind raced, calculating the impossible odds. 3 guns on him that he could see. Knuckles, his partner, and McCain. And who knew how many more of McCain's men were scattered throughout the room, just waiting. Even if he was fast enough to drop the 2 goons, McCain would use the chaos to put a bullet in a Celeste. There was no way out. No move he could make that didn't end with one or both of them dead. But as he looked into Celeste's eyes, he saw something that stopped his heart cold. She wasn't just trying to save him from the law. Her warning was deeper than that. She was trying to save him from himself, from becoming the man he used to be. The man who solved problems with violence. The man who left a trail of bodies behind him. The man he had fought so hard, for so long, to leave buried in the past. "Put it down, Thaddeus," she whispered, and hearing his first name from her lips in that moment felt like a pardon, like an absolution from an angel standing in the crossfire. Slowly, deliberately, with a pain that felt like surrendering a part of his own soul, Thaddeus lowered his weapon. He opened his hand and let the heavy Colt fall to the floor with a dull, final thud. A collective sigh of relief filled the saloon. The tension broke like a fever. McCain's smile was pure poison. "Excellent choice, Royce," he purred. "A truly wise decision." He gestured with his gun toward the back stairs, the ones that led to his office. The office with the soundproof room where he conducted his most brutal business. "Now, Miss Washington, shall we go discuss your debt?" But as McCain's men moved to grab her, Celeste did something no one, least of all Thaddeus, could have ever predicted. She laughed. It wasn't a laugh of hysteria or desperation. It was a clear, confident sound. The laugh of a poker player who has been letting everyone else bet, knowing all along that she holds the winning hand. "You know what's funny, Mr. McCain?" she said, her voice ringing through the now silent saloon. "You keep talking about debts and legal matters and murder charges, but you haven't asked the most important question of all." McCain's confidence flickered for the first time. He looked confused, thrown off balance. "What question is that?" "Why I came to your saloon, in this town, in the first place." Celeste reached into a hidden pocket sewn into the seams of her simple blue dress. She pulled out a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were crammed with neat, precise handwriting. "You see, I wasn't running from the law in Tombstone," she said, her voice rising with power. "I was gathering evidence." She opened the journal, and even from across the room, Thaddeus could see columns of numbers, dates, and names. McCain's face went white as a bleached desert bone. "3 years of your records, Vernon," Celeste continued, her voice like cracking ice. "Every stolen horse, every rigged card game, every man you cheated, every girl who disappeared up those stairs and never came back down. It's all in here, documented, with names, dates, and witness accounts I've spent the last 6 months collecting." Knuckles and the other hired gun looked utterly confused, glancing nervously at their boss. But McCain understood perfectly. He was looking at his entire criminal empire. Every dirty secret, every single crime, meticulously documented by a woman who was smart enough to make it all stick in a federal court. Celeste snapped the journal shut. The sound echoed in the silence. "So the real question, Mr. McCain," she said, her eyes blazing with the fire Thaddeus had first seen, "is what is that worth to you?" The air in the room crackled. The predator had become the prey. The tables hadn't just turned. They had been flipped over and set on fire. McCain's face cycled through a dozen emotions in the span of a single heartbeat. Shock, blinding rage, cold, hard calculation, and finally a murderous resolve. "Boss," Knuckles stammered, his scarred features twisted in confusion. "What's she talking about? What records?" "Shut up, you idiot!" McCain snarled, his eyes darting around the room. But the damage was done. Every man in that saloon was now looking at him differently. They weren't just looking at a crooked saloon owner. They were looking at a man who kept secrets. Dangerous secrets. Secrets that could get them all killed. Celeste held the journal against her chest like a shield. "Copies," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "are already with 3 different people in 3 different towns. A lawyer in Prescott, a journalist in Phoenix, and a friend I trust with my life. If I don't check in with them every week on a schedule, those copies go straight to the United States Marshals." It was a beautiful bluff. Thaddeus had to admire the sheer steel it took to deliver that line while surrounded by men who wanted her dead. It had to be a bluff, right? But he could see the calculation in McCain's eyes. He was weighing the odds. Could he find all 3 copies? Could he silence her and get to them before they were sent? Could he take that risk? "You're lying," McCain spat, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Celeste's voice was pure ice. She opened the journal again to a random page. "Let's see. March 15th, 1885. Horse theft. You and a man named Knuckles stole 6 head of cattle from the Morrison Ranch, rebranded them using a custom iron. You sold them in Tucson for $200. She looked up from the journal, her eyes locking on Knuckles. The branding iron you used is hidden in a false bottom of the safe in your office. Isn't it? Knuckles went so pale his scar stood out like a purple slash of paint. He looked at McCain, his expression a mix of terror and disbelief. How? How could she possibly know that? April the 2nd, Celeste continued, her voice relentless, ignoring the gasp from the crowd. Sarah McKinnon, 16 years old, last seen entering your private room upstairs. Her voice dropped, filled with a cold fury. Her body was found 3 days later in Devil's Canyon. Her throat was cut. The silver locket she always wore was pawned by your associate, Silas, the very next day in a shop 2 towns over. A wave of revulsion swept through the saloon. Several men started backing toward the doors, suddenly desperate to be anywhere else. Horse theft was one thing. Rigged card games, that was just business. But the murder of a young girl, that crossed a line. A line that even the most hardened men in this God-forsaken territory wouldn't cross. McCain's hand moved, a desperate, twitchy motion towards the gun tucked in his waistband. But Thaddeus was ready. He'd surrendered his gun, but not his will to fight. He took a step forward, ready to charge, to do anything to create a distraction. And McCain's hand froze. He wasn't looking at Thaddeus anymore. He wasn't even looking at Celeste. His eyes were fixed on something behind Thaddeus near the saloon doors, and his lips were curving into a slow, cruel smile. The smile of a man who's just remembered he has an ace hidden up his sleeve. Actually, Royce, McCain said, his voice dripping with venomous triumph, I think you're forgetting something important. Before Thaddeus could turn, before he could even process the words, he felt it. The cold, hard press of a gun barrel against the back of his neck. He'd been so focused on McCain, on Knuckles, on the threat in front of him. He'd completely forgotten about the other players on the board, the bartender who had been quietly polishing a glass this whole time, the piano player whose fingers had been silent for so long, the quiet men sitting at the corner tables who hadn't said a word all night. They were all McCain's men, and Thaddeus had walked right into the middle of them. Drop it, a voice whispered in his ear. The bartender's voice, nice and slow. It was a perfect trap. The whole saloon was the trap. Thaddeus's mind raced, trying to find a way out, an angle, a shot, but there was none. Too many guns, too many directions. Even if he spun and took out the bartender, Knuckles or McCain would shoot Celeste before he could even draw another breath. They were caught. Checkmate. But as the bartender's accomplice moved to disarm him fully, Celeste caught his eye. And in the space of a heartbeat, she mouthed a single impossible word. Trust. And then she did something utterly insane. She threw the journal. Not at McCain, not at anyone. She threw it straight up into the air, end over end, its pages fluttering like a wounded bird. It arced towards the big ornate oil lamp hanging from the center of the ceiling. And in that one brilliant, chaotic moment of distraction, every single eye in the saloon, McCain's, Knuckles, the bartenders, all of them instinctively followed the flight of the journal. And in that moment, 3 things happened at once. The man behind Thaddeus, the bartender, shifted his weight just enough to track the journal, the gun barrel moving a half-inch from his neck. Celeste dove behind a heavy oak poker table, disappearing from sight. And Thaddeus Royce remembered exactly why he had survived the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He just moved. The saloon erupted. Thaddeus spun, his body moving with a speed and violence that defied his years. His elbow connected with the bartender's nose with a sickening crunch, sending the man sprawling in a spray of blood. Thaddeus snatched the gun from the falling man's hand as the first gunshot thundered through the confined space. It was chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed in the smoky darkness like demonic lightning. Men were shouting, tables were overturned. The big mirror behind the bar shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was impossible to tell who was shooting at whom. The saloon patrons were scrambling for cover, caught in a crossfire they didn't understand. Thaddeus fired twice, dropping another of McCain's men, who was aiming at the table where Celeste was hidden. He saw Knuckles go down, clutching a bloody shoulder, taken out by a stray bullet from one of his own men. The air was thick with gunpowder and the smell of death. But through the smoke and the screaming, Thaddeus saw one thing with perfect, terrifying clarity. Vernon McCain, his face a mask of pure rage, was scrambling for the back door. He had caught the journal as it fell, and now he was running. Running with the only piece of evidence, the only thing that stood between Celeste and a hangman's noose. Thaddeus didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the bar, his boots crashing through a sea of broken glass, and charged after him, into the dark. The cool desert night hit him like a slap in the face. The sudden silence after the roar of the gunfight was deafening. He burst through the saloon's back door, his boots pounding against the wooden boardwalk. Up ahead, he saw McCain's silhouette, a shadow of a man disappearing around the corner of the general store. Behind him, the sounds of the fight were already dying down. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was catching the snake before he slithered away into the darkness forever. McCain was fast, fueled by desperation. But 15 years of hard ranch work had kept Thaddeus lean and strong. He gained on him with every stride, his spurs ringing out a deadly rhythm on the hard-packed earth of the main street. The town was dark, windows shuttered. No one wanted to be a witness. "McCain!" Thaddeus's voice was a roar that echoed between the false-fronted buildings. The saloon owner spun around, his chest heaving, his face twisted with a cornered animal's desperation. In his left hand, he clutched Celeste's precious journal. In his right, a gleaming Smith & Wesson revolver was pointed straight at Thaddeus's heart. "Should have minded your own damn business, Royce," McCain panted, raising the weapon, his hands shaking with rage. "Now you'll die with the rest of them." McCain's finger tightened on the trigger. Thaddeus braced himself for the flash, the impact, and then a new voice cut through the night. It was calm, steady, and carried the weight of absolute authority. "Vernon McCain, you're under arrest for murder, horse theft, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." Both men froze, turning toward the source of the voice. A tall figure stepped out from the deep shadows beside the sheriff's office. A silver star was pinned to his chest, catching the faint moonlight. It wasn't a local sheriff's badge. It was a U.S. Marshal's star. "Marshal Coleman," McCain breathed, the color draining from his face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. What are you doing here?" United States Marshal James Coleman stepped fully into the light. His face was weathered leather. His eyes were chips of cold blue granite. He looked like a man who had seen everything and was impressed by nothing. "Following up on some very interesting telegrams I've been receiving for the past 6 months, Vernon. Seems someone's been documenting your activities. Quite thoroughly." The world tilted under Thaddeus's feet. Telegrams. Celeste hadn't been bluffing. It was never a bluff. The copies were real. "The woman in your saloon," Marshal Coleman continued, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered gun, "has been working as an agent of this office for the past 6 months. And that journal you're holding is federal property. It contains enough evidence to hang you 3 times over." McCain let out a high, desperate, unhinged laugh. "Agent? She's a fugitive. She killed a man in Tombstone, a mayor's son." "She killed a man who was trying to rape her while she was investigating his connection to your horse theft operation," Coleman corrected, his voice flat and cold. "A man who, it turns out, was your silent partner, and the territorial governor has already signed a full pardon for her actions, based on the evidence she provided last week." The truth hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. Not a victim, not a fugitive, an undercover federal agent, the whole thing. From the moment she walked into that saloon, the auction, the murder charge, the journal, it was all a sting. A brilliantly orchestrated performance designed to make McCain reveal himself, to get him to incriminate himself on his own stage. McCain's eyes darted between the marshal and Thaddeus, his mind a whirlwind of calculation, searching for an escape that didn't exist. And then his face hardened with the grim resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. "Maybe so," he snarled, a feral glint in his eye. "But she's still in that saloon with my boys. And unless you want to find what's left of her in the morning, you'll let me walk away." "Right. Now." It was his last card, a desperate, evil bluff. But as the words left his mouth, footsteps echoed from the alley beside the saloon. and Celeste Washington emerged from the shadows. She was very much alive. Her blue dress was torn and dusty. There was a smudge of gunpowder on her cheek, but she was completely unharmed. Walking in front of her, their hands held high in the air, were Knuckles and the other surviving members of McCain's gang. They looked like men who had just discovered they'd brought knives to a cannon fight. McCain's shoulders sagged. The last of the fight went out of him. The journal, his last hope, slipped from his numb fingers. It hit the dust with a soft, final thud, the sound of a coffin lid closing. "It's over, Vernon," Marshal Coleman said quietly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "You've got nowhere left to run." But Thaddeus barely heard him. He couldn't take his eyes off Celeste. She walked with a confidence, a certainty that made it clear she had never truly been in danger. She had been in control of the entire situation from the very beginning. "Agent Washington," the marshal nodded to her, a deep respect in his voice. "Outstanding work. The territorial governor will be very pleased." Celeste smiled, a small, tired smile, but her eyes found Thaddeus's. "Thank you, Marshal, but I couldn't have done it without Mr. Royce here. His unexpected intervention created the perfect opportunity to expose McCain and his entire operation." Thaddeus felt his world tilt sideways for the second time that night. An opportunity. His sacrifice, his willingness to give up everything he owned, had just been an opportunity in her plan. A variable. "You knew," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "From the moment I stood up in that saloon, you knew what was going to happen." "Not exactly," Celeste admitted, moving closer to him, away from the marshal and the prisoners. Her voice was lower now, meant only for him. "I knew McCain would try to use the fake murder charge to extort money from someone. That was the trap. I knew he'd overplay his hand when he was cornered, but I didn't know someone would be brave enough to offer up their entire life for a stranger." She reached out and her fingers gently touched his arm. Her touch was warm against his skin. Or their ranch. The deed. The yellowed piece of paper was still in his vest pocket. His whole life offered up without a moment's hesitation for a woman he thought was doomed. A woman who had been playing a part. "Why?" he asked quietly. The same question she had asked him, but now filled with a universe of new meaning. "Why didn't you tell me? You let me think." "Because," Celeste said, her voice soft but steady as she looked up at him. "I needed to know. I needed to see if the kind of man you appeared to be was real. My job, it shows you the worst of humanity day after day. You start to wonder if there's any good left." Her gaze was intense, searching his. "I needed to know what you would do when everything was on the line. And now I do." Marshal Coleman cleared his throat, a diplomatic sound in the quiet street. "Agent Washington, your assignment here is officially complete. You're free to return to Denver for reassignment." He paused, then glanced meaningfully between the two of them. "Or you could take some well-deserved leave." McCain and his men were loaded into a waiting wagon, their faces sullen and defeated. But Thaddeus barely noticed them go. He was lost in Celeste's eyes, trying to piece together the man he was an hour ago with the man he was now. "So," he asked, his voice rough, "what happens now?" Celeste was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the vast, star-dusted Arizona sky. She looked like she was finally breathing freely for the first time in months. "Well," she said, turning back to him, "I suppose that depends. You offered me my freedom tonight, Mr. Royce, even though I didn't need it." A small smile played on her lips. "The question is, what would you say to a partnership?" "What kind of partnership?" Her smile widened, and it was like watching the sunrise after the longest, darkest night of his life. "The kind where a retired federal agent with a talent for bookkeeping helps a rancher with more land than he knows what to do with build something better than either of them could manage alone. The kind where two people who have seen the absolute worst of the world try to create something good. Something that lasts." Thaddeus thought about his ranch. His empty, silent ranch. He thought about his solitary life, the years he'd spent telling himself that being alone was safer than having hope. Then he thought about the impossible courage it must have taken for Celeste to walk into that saloon alone, armed with nothing but a journal and a plan, knowing she might not walk out alive. The Circle R could use someone who knows how to read and write, he said finally, a ghost of a smile touching his own lips. And someone who isn't afraid of a fight. And Celeste Washington, she replied, her voice soft, could use a place to call home. Somewhere far enough from town that a woman and a man can build a new life without people asking too many questions about their past. As the marshal's wagon disappeared into the darkness and the chaos of the saloon faded into a memory, Thaddeus and Celeste stood together in the middle of the dusty street where their lives had been irrevocably changed. Tomorrow would bring 1,000 new challenges. But tonight, under the endless Arizona stars, two survivors who had found each other in the heart of darkness began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth more than gold, something worth more than land. They had found something worth fighting for, together. If you enjoyed that story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the stories we have coming are only going to get darker and more twisted, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Now, for a story that will truly test your courage, click on the video you see on your screen right now. You won't regret it, or maybe you will.